Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Gordon, host of the Age of Ravi Books podcast, done in partnership with the New Books Network. In this podcast, we try to interview fiction and nonfiction authors working in, around, and about the Asia-Pacific region. What is Hinduism? For centuries, that was a thorny question, both for local Indians and for colonial outsiders. People inside and outside the country tried to define what Hinduism was. Missionaries grappled with Hindu practices, finding both similarities and dangerous differences with their own Christian faith. The East India Company adopted several Hindu practices to keep the peace, much to the chagrin of officials back in London, and increasingly, Indians began to define what Hinduism meant as part of a broader political awakening. Manu Pillai tells that story in his latest book, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, The Making of the Modern Hindu Identity. Manu is also the author of the critically acclaimed The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, and False Allies. Former Chief of Staff to Shashi Tharoor, Pillai is also a winner of the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar and holds a PhD in history from King's College London. His essays and writings on history have appeared in various national and international publications. So, Manu, thank you so much for coming on the show again to talk about your most recent book, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, The Making of the Modern Hindu Identity. A easy or straightforward first question. Why did you want to tackle this topic in the first place?
Well, I was born in 1990, and by the time I was in my teens, which is when most of us develop our own, sense of the world, the politics around us, you start having an opinion on things. India was under its first right-wing government, as it were, under the BJP. So there was this Hindu nationalist movement that had been building up through the 90s. And by the time I was an adolescent, they were actually in government ruling from Delhi. So obviously I grew up and sort of came into my own at a time when there were a lot of conversations brewing about what this meant, what the idea of the country meant. The past was contested, just as we see it all around the world now. People no longer have one definite sense of the past. There's all kinds of competing narratives. And I lived through some of that. So already when I was doing my master's as a 21-year-old, way back in 2010-11, I remember writing my master's dissertation on Hindu nationalism and the rise of Hindu nationalism. So the topic had been playing on my mind for a while. I didn't think I was confident enough to do a book on the topic for some more years. So it was only about 2019 that I thought, okay, I want to explore the roots of Hindu nationalism. So the book is not about Hindu nationalism, but it's an investigation into some of the historical dynamics that might have created the ground on which Hindu nationalism now stands. So with that in mind, I thought by 2019 that I was ready to do a book. I did about half of the book in 2020, realized that I needed to do a lot more homework. So I put the writing aside and did some more research and finally finished the book by the middle of last year. And the book was released in November. So the topic was of interest to me because as an Indian, as a millennial growing up in India of the 21st century, Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, as we call it, the Hindu identity, and the hows and whys and ifs of that identity, all of these were playing on my mind in general. And these are very much part of the public conversation around us. And I think at a broader level, historians and scholars are also creatures of society. So sometimes the way we choose our topics, the themes that interest us, all of these things are linked very much to our place in the world as well, what's happening around us as well. So while I've been careful to not let the present intrude into the book and color anything to the best of my abilities, at the same time, it would be disingenuous to suggest that the present didn't have any role in getting me interested in the topic to start with.
So, I mean, I know this is going to be a very hard question because, but how would you define Hinduism? First broadly. And then more specifically, how would you understand a quote-unquote Hindu identity?
So Hinduism isn't a religion of the book. So you have in Islam and Christianity, for instance, you have a core sacred scripture or text. And then there's a religious tradition that evolves out of that text. So even though there may be different sects with competing or even contradictory understandings, and there may be a lot of, it's not a monolith on either side. There may be a lot of conflicts within these folds. At the core, there is still some form of a sacred text and a prophet. That's the structure for Islam and Christianity. But you'll find that a lot of religions towards the East, especially, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism, don't necessarily have that kind of an evolution. And I would define Hinduism not so much as a religion in the Western sense of the term, but more as a common framework through which multiple sects and groups and religious systems are able to become part of the same fabric. So there's a running thread or a common framework into which all kinds of diverse ideas can fit, some of them quite deeply contradictory, with a looser sort of understanding of itself as a religion. So the very irony is that the word Hinduism did not exist for the 18th century. So although today we take it for granted, that term itself is something that emerged in the late 18th century. It was used by a white man for the first time. Yet it represented something that was familiar to people who today we call Hindus, the people who lived in India. Which is why they were able to run with that term and make it their own and really own that term for themselves. So Hinduism really has a long arc of evolution. You can, at one point in India, in the ancient time, there was something called the Vedic religion, which the Indo-Aryans promoted. But India is also a very diverse place. As this Indo-Aryan culture spread through the Indian subcontinent, it came face to face with all kinds of other traditions and groups and cults. So there were tribal cults, there were image worshippers. You have a whole spectrum of rituals ranging from blood sacrifice to even human sacrifice in some parts, but also what we call the vegetarian traditions that are more non-violent. So it's really a complex negotiation and interaction between all of these traditions that gives birth to that common framework. And the common framework does have certain elements that run throughout the country, and you can sort of see them everywhere. For instance, there's something we call the sacred geography of India, which is that even for somebody who stays in a very specific cultural zone or a very specific part of the country, they may yet be aware of sacred sites far away in the north. They may not be able to point it out on a map, but they have a sense there is such and such a place in the north. And these are all united through a shared set of legends, a shared set of myths, a shared set of stories. And it's through this rather amorphous, rather shifting, rather flexible set of traditions that Hinduism as we know it takes shape. So it really isn't determined on the basis of a religious text, although, of course, there are texts like the Vedas, there are the epics. Hindus have the Bhagavad Gita, which are now considered integral texts of Hinduism. A lot of actual practiced Hinduism doesn't have much to do with these texts. They were often the preserve of just intellectuals and scholars and Brahmins who were the highest priestly caste category. For most Hindus, it was a set of shared rituals, shared practices, temple culture, those elements. And that's how I think of this common framework to form, and then eventually acquired the name Hinduism. So in the book, the analogy I gave is that think of a river that originates in multiple streams. As a river, it also gives birth to new streams. And then somewhere along the way, it picks up a name which we now recognize it by, which is Hinduism. That's really the analogy that I offer to explain how Hinduism took form. When we speak of the Hindu identity, that is a sort of more political version of this Hinduism. It's not just religion, but it's about how the Hindus self-identify, self-represent, etc. And there, what's interesting is that often you find that religions around the world, they self-define based on another. There's always somebody else they define themselves against. So even if it's the evolution of Christianity and Judaism as isms or as organized religions, you do find in the early period the two playing off each other in order to construct their separateness. And because they come out of the same broader cultural traditions, but the way they separate themselves is by playing off each other and contrasting each other from, one from the other. And you see something like that happening with Hinduism as well. At one point, you find that there were, of course, rival sects within what we now call Hinduism. There was something called the Shaktas who worshipped the great goddess. There were the Shaivas who worshipped Shiva. There were Vaishnavas who worshipped Vishnu. And these had their own competition and their own contradictions. Yet, come face to face with, say, Buddhism or Jainism, which also originated in India, there were some things that united the first three and separated them from Buddhism and Jainism. We broadly make the difference by saying that Buddhism and Jainism are what are called Shramanic schools, whereas these are the Hindu schools or the Brahmanic schools. And so there was already a vague sense that there was something that set certain traditions within India in one camp and certain other traditions in the other camp. Then you have an encounter with Islam starting from the medieval period. And I think this is where the word Hindu itself becomes sort of more and more popular in India, because it's originally people coming in from the west, from Persia, from Arabic lands, etc., who are referring to people who live across the Sindhu River or the Indus River as Hindus. So that's really where the term comes from. But by the medieval period, you find, again, Hindus are owning the term and using it to self-represent, because now they've come face to face, not just with Islam as a religion, but also, as you might know if you've read a little bit of Indian history, you have Islamic rulers coming into the country. So there's the Turkic invasions, you have the Delhi Sultanate, and you have the Mughals coming in. So at the top level, at the imperial level, you now have Muslim rulers. So you not only have Islam as a religion, which had already come to India long before through commercial networks, through the sea, through peaceful embassies of trade, but now you have Islamic power to deal with. And when there's a new power structure with its own religious ideology, etc., that's when you find this grouping in India that we now call Hindus, self-identifying as Hindus. And it appears in all kinds of sources. So you find there are texts across the social spectrum, so not just courtly texts, but also texts on the ground by, say, a weaver and poet and saint like Kabir in the medieval period in North India. In the south, similarly, you find these Hindu kings calling themselves Hindu Raya Suratrana, or sultans among Hindu kings. So they're also using the word Hindu consciously to define themselves as something that is not Islamic or something that is not like the rest of the sultans, and so on. So you see the word Hindu becoming more and more popular in the medieval period, or at least people we now recognize as Hindus using the term for themselves, even though the term came from outside. It's a little bit like, to give you another analogy, it's like the word Indian, right? Nobody in India actually called this country India, and we didn't self-identify as Indians. But today it's completely natural to us because it does represent our homeland. It does represent how we ourselves self-identify. So the term's original foreignness doesn't matter. You're able to own it and make it your own. Just as the English language was also owned by Indians and made one of their languages in the subcontinent. So it's a complex process. I'm trying to simplify it without making it simplistic. But this is where you see the original roots of what we call the Hindu identity. Originally loosely formed around, say, Buddhism and Jainism. Although there wasn't a term, there was a sense that some traditions that were opposed to Buddhism and Jainism did share something in common. And then with the coming of the term Hindu with Islamic rulers and Islam, that term offers an umbrella or a canopy under which all of these traditions that share something can occupy space and construct themselves as one shared identity. And then, of course, as the book explores, and this is the main thrust of the book, which is the colonial period and how the encounter with Christianity gives Hinduism its current modern shape and the Hindu identity its current modern substance.
Right. They kind of needed to be something to define itself against, right? And I guess the Mughals provided that. Well, then the Europeans show up, so you have the Jesuits come in, you have the company come in. I mean, how did these early Europeans, how did they understand Hinduism, and what was kind of the divides between them as they tried to understand what this was?
They were very confused to start with because, of course, they had some vague notions about this all the way back in Europe, for example, all the way from Greek literature, which during the Renaissance, etc., had there's a renewed interest in Greek literature, etc. in that time. There were references to Brahmins, and at one point, Europe had very romanticized notions of this idealized Brahmin in India who led a pure, godly kind of life. But when they actually started coming to India in larger numbers, let's say from the Portuguese period onwards, which is about 1498, 1500, from that period onwards, they came face to face with a culture that they were unable to understand. And when you can't understand something, you try to make sense of it through your own cultural prisms and through categories and concepts that you already know. But this resulted in a rather stilted, skewed, and peculiar picture. For instance, these early Europeans would come to India and they would look at temples and they would look at deities inside Hindu temples. And they were scandalized because there were all these goddesses who looked rather, fiery with their weapons and their, tongues sticking out and crushing somebody under their feet. There was a deity like Narasimha who's ripping open a human figure. These are all, of course, linked to Hindu legends where God takes form in different ways as different avatars to destroy evil, etc. But for a foreigner looking in, who's completely oblivious to all of these local legends, it looked like these were monsters. So they essentially concluded that, the Hindus are essentially a pagan worshipping group or a pagan group that's worshipping the devil. All of their religion is essentially satanic. Now, there was another reason for this, which is that in their worldview, there was only one God in the world, the supreme power, and God had appeared to mankind in various forms. There were various prophets. Jesus was, of course, the ultimate prophet, and there was the Bible. So the only way to know God was through the Bible and through Christianity. So necessarily, anything that was not from the Bible, not inspired by the Bible, and was not Christianity had to be something else. It could not be about God. It had to be about Satan. It had to be about devils. It had to be about monsters. And this was also how Europe had originally lost its own pagan cultures. As Christianity spread through Europe, its pagan cultures were also branded as satanic and monster worshipping and devil worshipping, etc. So the early Europeans brought that prism to India and started applying this to the Hindus in India. But then they started talking to the local Brahmins and talking to local Hindus and discovered that these people had no great appetite for conversion. It wasn't like they saw the Bible and they instinctively jumped with joy and said, let's now convert to Christianity. On the contrary, they were completely disinterested and they had no, they were not particularly keen. And as they spoke to Brahmins, they also discovered that Hindus had their own sense of God. Yes, they recognized that there is ultimately only one God. But in their conception, God presided over a polytheistic infrastructure. So it's monotheism at its core, but with a polytheistic infrastructure around it. And this has a reason because, as I said, Hinduism developed by drawing in all kinds of cults and traditions, not denying anything, but creating space for everything. So for that reason, Hinduism therefore had a lot of diverse traditions within, but overarching, there was an idea that yes, there is only one God and God takes multiple forms, and for different people, God will have different paths. And this is essentially what the Brahmins would often tell the early Europeans, and especially the missionaries who started coming into India. They would say that, look, God is omnipotent and all-loving. It's very unlikely God would have created a religion meant for all of mankind and given it only to you. It's very unlikely God would have created a book, when referring to the Bible, and given it only to you if he intended it for everybody. No, the Brahmins would argue, they would say that God has actually created multiple paths for different kinds of people. So yes, we recognize the Bible, we acknowledge that it's a sacred text, we admire the story of Jesus that you're telling us, but that is how God appeared to you in your part of the world and to serve your culture. Whereas for us, God appeared in different ways, as say the 10 avatars that Vishnu took and to save humankind. That is how God appeared here. That is how God gave us our scriptures, such as the Vedas, such as the Gita, etc. So we have no desire or need for the Bible. We have no desire or need for Christianity because God has already showed us a different path for our culture and our people. So the fundamental disagreement was the European insistence that there was only one path to God and there was only one sacred text through which you could know God. And the Hindu response that actually that there were multiple paths to God and there were multiple ways in which you could reach God and through multiple texts and traditions. This was one contradiction between the two. At a political level, you find that Europeans engaged with Hindus in different ways, and this is where power comes into the picture. Because you do see that power really tilts the balance and determines how both groups are responding and debating each other. So in a place like Goa on India's western coast, where the Portuguese actually conquered a bit of territory and they had an enclave there all the way till the middle of the 20th century, initially they were okay with the Hindus. They didn't particularly meddle in local religion. But once that power was entrenched, and partly because the Catholics were also under attack for being bad Christians, as it were, from the emerging Protestant movement in Europe, the Catholics ruling in Goa, the Portuguese in Goa, felt some pressure to demonstrate that they were good Christians. And because of other dynamics in Europe, they decided to take a much more aggressive stance against Hinduism and the local traditions in Goa. So now in Goa, you find by the middle of the 16th century a persecution of Hindus. The temples are being smashed and replaced by churches. Temple objects and metal and gold, etc., is being melted down and converted into crosses, etc. Communities are forced to pick up and go into exile because their way of life is under attack. And there's a pressure from the Portuguese state in Goa to not just convert people to Christianity, but also to Europeanize them. So they're told that Hindu names won't do. They must have Western names. Hindu clothes won't do. They must have Western clothes. Local music won't do. They must now start playing European musical instruments. So there's a pressure to Christianize, but it's also linked very much to power in Western culture. So that's how Goa, you find Christianity spreading in certain parts of Goa under pressure like that. But you also see an initial resistance from Hindus of a political nature, where Hindus are also reacting to this sometimes aggressively, sometimes violently by killing missionaries, etc. Sometimes creatively by reconverting people who had moved over to Christianity to Hinduism. Sometimes by just running away with their gods and establishing even bigger temples to those gods outside the frontiers of the Portuguese state and outside Goa. So you find there's a political articulation now of the Hindu identity in places like this. Elsewhere, however, the missionary or the European engagement with Hindus takes a slightly different tone, because there's no Portuguese state or European state to pressure Hindus in any way. On the contrary, it's local Hindus who are in power, and the missionary who comes into these inland territories and has to persuade, because he doesn't have arms or weapons or the Portuguese around him. In these places, you actually see that it is Christianity that has to transform itself. So if in Goa, Hindus were under pressure to Christianize and Westernize, in these interior parts of India, it is the white man who has to Hinduize, and not just Hinduize himself and his conduct, but Hinduize Christianity itself. So by the early 17th century, you find an Italian Jesuit called Roberto de Nobili going to a place called Madura in the south of India. And it's inland. It was an outpost of the Vijayanagara Empire of South India, and a Hindu place with Hindu rulers and a big Hindu temple, etc. And here he realizes that he can't convert people if he continues to look European and look so alien to local people and local culture. So he essentially starts dressing like Hindu gurus in saffron robes. He recognizes the concept of caste. So even when he converts people, he says, yes, you're coming in from an upper caste, so you can retain your upper caste privileges and your upper caste culture. If somebody else is coming in from a lower caste, he would keep them at a lower status. So in church, the upper caste converts will sit in front, the lower caste ones will be kept at the door. He maintains ideas of caste. The Bible itself is presented not as a sort of radically different text, but he says that, look, you Hindus have your 4 Vedas, think of the Bible as the 5th Veda. In fact, in South India, you find that these Jesuit priests would even start mimicking the Brahmins, because the Brahmins were seen as the priestly elite of the Hindus. And the Brahmins became vegetarian. They would sit on the floor and eat vegetarian Brahmin cooked meals out of a plantain leaf. They would take Brahmin cooks with them everywhere. And they essentially took the appearance and form of any other Hindu guru in the region. So they had white skin, but they had completely acquired the garb of the brown man. And this really worked wonders. And you find that in South India, in fact, at shrines to Christian saints, there were even Christians who would go and sacrifice goats, just as you'd sacrifice goats to a Hindu goddess like Kali. So it's very interesting that in Goa, where power was with the European, the pressure was to convert and to become westernized. But in areas where Christian missionaries who had to function under Hindu rule, it was Christianity that was Hinduized. And it tells us something larger also about how religions are also malleable. And this is how religions adapt and survive over different periods of time. They're not one commodity or one rigid substance. In different parts of the world, they do acquire different faces and appearances. And if Christianity was transformed in South India into something different, something more hybrid, and it remains that way, by the way. In South India, you find Catholic priests who still wear saffron robes, who still essentially have a lot of Hinduized rituals and customs. They do, of course, identify as Christians, and they have the cross and the Bible. But a lot of their everyday culture and customs are rather Hinduized. And similarly, you find that eventually the Hindus who operate in areas under European rule, especially as most of India comes under British rule, they also reconceptualize their Hinduism slightly in a Western mold, because the Western mold is now staring them in the face. And they think that in order to survive, their religion must also reinvent itself. And that's essentially what the book explores, about how modern Hinduism acquires a mold that is Western and perhaps influenced by Christianity. But it's still Hindu. It's just that it acquires a different shape, having come face to face with colonialism, the West, and with Christianity.
Last question on foreigners. Later on, I think when the company is much more, the East India Company is much more in control of India, you note that there's this tension between the missionaries that show up, who basically are, again, very aggressive at wanting to convert all of India, and then the company who, has decided to go along to get along with a lot of different, like adopting the taxes on pilgrims like the old rulers used to do, generally showing up to Hindu events. I mean, how does this political battle play out between the company and all of these new, all these new migrants with missionary zeal?
In fact, that's my favorite part of the book, that chapter. It's chapter 5. It's, when the East India Company first started hoovering up territories in India, they were very, very cautious, because they knew they were a small elite, a small number of white people and foreigners in a country they couldn't fully understand. They relied on Indian soldiers. So although we say that the British conquered India backed by Indian bankers and supported by Indian brown soldiers who actually, took salaries from them and served their cause. But they also didn't want these soldiers to mutiny, and they recognized that religion and identity was one area where if the white man interfered and where if they allowed, say, Christian sensibilities to determine how they acted, then the Hindu soldiers might mutiny. So for their own security, the British felt that they had to have a more tolerant and accommodative kind of strategy in India. In fact, they were not just tolerant. In many ways, it looked like they were endorsing Hinduism. And as you put it very correctly, they mimicked, as they conquered territories, they mimicked the local Hindu Rajas they had toppled from those places. So you often find that in the late 18th century and first decades of the 19th century, white men are making donations at Hindu temples. They're appearing during festivals. It's East India Company soldiers who are escorting these deities during their great processions into the cities and to rivers or wherever it is. You find white men making donations to temples. So there's Thomas Munro, who was a big administrator, makes donations to the big temple in Tirupati. Even now, perhaps one of the most popular temples in India. In Trivandrum in Kerala, it was what is called the Padmanabha Swami temple, which is the wealthiest temple in the world. It has a huge treasure trove sitting in its vaults. A man called John Munro, who's the British agent in the region, he makes very rich donations. In Madurai in South India, which is exactly where Roberto de Nobili essentially Brahmanized Christianity and Hinduized Christianity. In that same town, Bruce Peter makes donations to the deity, etc., etc. So the white man is not just tolerant of Hinduism, he's actually, in some ways, patronizing Hinduism in this time. And you see at this time, Hindus are also responding. They're willing to work with the East India Company because the East India Company is operating on their terms. But at the same time, there's something else happening in Europe. So at the same time that white men are patronizing Hinduism here, there's a religious revival that is taking place in Europe and specifically in Britain. So after the Enlightenment, where reason and rationality, etc., were popularized and sort of promoted quite aggressively by certain intellectuals, there was a kind of counter to that in the form of this new evangelical movement taking place. Political events also fed into it. For example, the loss of America and people in Britain saying that Britain had lost God's favor and that they needed a renewal of faith. So there was a growth of, and the Industrial Revolution, of course, which unleashes new class dynamics. Because of all of that, there were new dynamics in plain British society and a new religious revival. And now in this time, you find there's an organized missionary evangelical campaign telling Parliament that actually it is our job to civilize India. How is it that the white man sits and patronizes Brahmins and idol worshippers and pagans when their duty should be to actually promote Christianity and save these people, etc., etc. So now there's pressure building up at home in Britain, asking that the East India Company let in more missionaries, asking that they actually spread Christianity, etc. The East India Company men are not keen at all to start with. They don't want missionaries here. They think missionaries will just wreck the sort of astute but also fragile social negotiation and arrangement they've reached with the Hindus and Hindu society. But the missionary lobby ultimately wins. In 1813, they're given access to India for the first time. Yet officials are, of course, permitted to bar them from certain provinces, etc. By the 1830s, the missionary has complete access. So you find that missionaries are starting to appear at temple festivals of Hindus, preaching the Bible outside their sacred sites. And the missionary becomes a bit more aggressive at this time, and much more hostile presence as far as the Hindu is concerned. These are also Protestant missionaries. So they are no longer dressing up like Hindu saints and holy men in saffron robes. They're sticking to their European appearance. They're sticking to their European identity, and they are aggressively going around telling Hindus that their culture is bad, their religion is bad, and they need to convert. So it's at this time that you find a kind of, again, a political activation among Hindu intellectuals who realize that their identity is under siege, and you find the early inklings or the early sort of signs or symptoms of what would become Hindu nationalism down the line. So initially, Hindus respond not so much in an organized way, but you find strange, interesting eyewitness accounts of how the Hindus are responding. For instance, there's this festival called the Ram Leela, where the epic Ramayana is enacted. And at the end of it, the villain of the Ramayana, who's this demon king called Ravana, there's an effigy that's created, and there's a flaming arrow shot at Ravana, and Ravana's effigy goes up in flames. And suddenly, missionaries traveling in North India started discovering that at these Ram Leela performances, the Ravana seems to be dressed in the clothes of the English East India Company Governor General. So they think, clearly something is amiss. People are making some kind of a statement. Similarly, Hindus now have come face to face with Christianity. They don't understand Christianity very much, but they realize this is something to reckon with, and they need to find some kind of a place in their worldview for Christianity. So they create this story where they say that all the Hindu traditions that God created had been so successful, and they were spiritually uplifting all of these Hindus in India, that everybody was landing up in heaven. And because of this, hell was facing a depopulation and cosmic balance was disturbed. And God, requiring cosmic balance, decided that he must create a fraudulent faith so that some souls could be waylaid into going into hell. And that fraudulent faith, that terrible, bad, evil, wicked faith was Christianity. So there are these interesting ways in which Hindus are responding to Christianity. You also start seeing these great public debates taking place. So just as the missionary is going out into public places, in fact, you see these from the 18th century itself. There was the first Protestant missionary in India was a German called Ziegenbalg, Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg, who comes to Tranquebar on the eastern coast. And he has these great debates and literary exchanges through letters, etc., with local Hindu leaders. And that's why you find these debates on religion taking place. But now these are public events. At least in his case, these were epistolary kind of exchanges. But these now in the 19th century are public debates where a Hindu guru or a Hindu intellectual sit down with missionaries. And if the missionary takes pot shots at Hinduism, the Hindu will reciprocate and attack Christianity. And you find this, of course, with earlier missionaries as well. For example, they'll say that, oh, your Hindu gods are ridiculous. Krishna's dancing around with young women. You've got an elephant-headed deity who makes no sense at all, completely illogical, and you're all idolatrous. This is an idolatrous culture. To which the Hindus will respond by saying, well, if Jesus was really God's son, then how could he get put up on a cross? That doesn't add up. You call us idolaters, but what about the processions of the Virgin Mary that you take out? Isn't that a form of idolatry? So there are these debates taking place. And there is a public sort of arousal of interest in these Hindu-Christian kind of conflicts. Of course, the military aspect of this emerges with what is called the Great Rebellion of 1857, where in much of North India, there is a big mutiny that takes place of the East India Company troops, and they resist the East India Company. Of course, the British ultimately prevail, but it does shake the British, and East India Company rule comes to an end, and the British crown takes over India, and Queen Victoria assures everybody that their religion will be safe and respected, and so on. But even there, you do find that among the rebel leaders who attempted to push the English and the East India Company out of India, religion was a very important part. Everything from the white man's appetite for beef, when in fact the cow is sacred for Hindus, their interference in local practices, the patronage that they seem to be giving increasingly to missionaries who are being hostile and rather negative to Hindus in their own country, outside their own temples. All of this is in play, and it does affect, and there is a religious flavor. The rebellion is not purely economic or political. One of the glues that brings it together is religious fervor and an assertion of religious identity among the Hindus as well as the Muslims of India against the Christian or the seemingly Christian British Empire. So while the British, of course, were very conflicted, as I said, there were officials who wanted nothing to do with missionaries. From the prism of the Hindu on the ground, it looked like the British were, in fact, a Christianizing force, and the missionary was looking like something of a threat.
So let's talk about some of these attempts to define Hinduism and define the Hindu identity. What were some of these earliest attempts to kind of define what this was, and what were some of the main schools of thought or points of contention between different thinkers?
So again, all religions, as I said, are not monoliths, right? So there's always going to be different interpretations and groups within it. Of course, the whatever becomes the orthodoxy brands everybody else heretical, and you've got those impulses in Hinduism as well. But in the 19th century, what we see is something very specific. So you have in the early 19th century a gentleman called Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was born in the late 18th century, comes into his own by the early 19th century, and becomes perhaps one of the most recognizable Indians and Hindus of the early 19th century. He's fluent in Bengali, his mother tongue. He speaks Persian, he speaks English, he's very well read. What's interesting with him is that in his earliest writings, he's actually not it's almost like an Enlightenment figure. Although he had no exposure to Enlightenment texts at that time, Voltaire, Rousseau, none of that. Through Persian traditions, etc., he was somebody who questioned religion itself as a concept and institution. His argument was that God is one, supreme God, right? All over the world, there can't be multiple gods. There is one God for all of the universe. And yet, you find religions have contradictory doctrines. So, if Islam says you cannot worship before images, Hinduism permits the worship of images. So he said, contradiction could not have been created by God. It was man-made, and therefore necessarily all religious traditions are primarily of human make. So he was originally somebody who seemed to almost flirt with the idea that religion itself was not logically an interesting concept. It had a lot of contradictions. But within a few years, he realizes that religion is linked very much to identity. And he has there's his writing where he says something along the lines of how the Hindus in their present practice of religion is not conducive to their political state or something along those lines. And that Hinduism requires a reformation of sorts in order to make the Hindus politically strong and regain some of their vitality. So what he does is he almost takes a Protestant view of religion and applies that to Hinduism. And it's interesting because on the one hand, he's, as I said, appropriating a Western mold of religion, but he's not doing it passively. He uses it to reframe Hinduism in a way that same Western mold is used to defend Hinduism and resist conversion and resist Christianity. So in Europe and faced with British Protestants, the idea of religion that Ram Mohan Roy sees is that there was the Bible was corrupted by the Catholic Church, and the Protestant Reformation essentially goes back to scripture and goes back to the pristine purity of the Christian faith. And he says Hinduism requires something like that. We had the Vedas and the Upanishads. The Upanishads, the Vedas, of course, were also, it wasn't one text written at one time. They were composed over several centuries, the supreme corpus, the supreme scriptural texts of Hinduism. And you find all kinds of impulses in it. There is, in the oldest segment of the Vedas, there is something that looks very polytheistic. There are multiple gods. But in the later philosophical segments called the Upanishads, which evolved at a very different period, you do find a more abstract deity. You do find God in a monotheistic frame. And in fact, this is a formless, supreme kind of figure. So there's no worship of images, none of those things. It's a very intellectualized, rational idea of God. So Ram Mohan Roy essentially says, let's go back to that Upanishadic framing of God, the supreme, formless God. Give up the idols, give up the temples, rationalize Hinduism. And just as the Protestants cleansed Christianity of what was seen as Catholic corruptions, he wants Hindus to fall back on the Upanishads and give up everything of actual living Hindu culture with their temples and idols. So that's the framing he develops, which is a very intellectualized framing. And what's interesting is he also uses this to resist Christianity. In fact, earlier you have a lot of white men writing about Hinduism, but he's one of those first men who's actually using the English language to write about Christianity. So you have a Hindu writing about Christianity and critiquing Christianity. He even makes the statement that ultimately God in Christianity is divided into the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which means God is being cut up into three. So God is not a unitary concept in Christianity, and that therefore Christianity is still weak. So converting from Hinduism to Christianity would be like converting from one superstition to the other. But a revived Hinduism of the Upanishads would present a God who, as I described earlier, is indivisible, abstract, formless, shapeless. And he thinks this is even more rational a conception of God than Christianity. So he uses this framing of God from the Hindu traditions, but placed into a Protestant mold in order to revivify and redefine, but also defend Hinduism. So that's one way in which he creates an intellectual framing for Hinduism. And even now, when a lot of Hindu intellectuals speak of Hinduism, especially when addressing Western audiences, it is this philosophical, abstract kind of Hinduism that they highlight. Then you have somebody like Dayananda Saraswati. He was born on the other side of India. So Ram Mohan Roy operated in Bengal on the eastern side. Dayananda was born in Gujarat, right on the west coast. And he was born into a Brahmin family, into a family where they were priests, etc. But he was disillusioned by image worship, not because he encountered a missionary attacking image worship, but simply because one day during a ritual, he saw a mouse running around an image of Shiva, and he thought that if the idol is God, why is it the God can't even defend himself against a rodent? And this causes him to leave his family behind and become a wandering ascetic. And he moves about for 20 years trying to find a guru, trying to find answers, ultimately reaches the conclusion that, again, Hinduism can only be sort of regenerated by going back to the Vedas. He's also not interested in idols. He's also not interested in temples. But what's more interesting about this gentleman, Dayananda, is that in addition to, of course, this, back to the Vedas, a back to scripture kind of almost Protestant reading of faith, he's also interested in moving Hindus on the ground as a people. And he's a little after Ram Mohan Roy. So this is a few decades later. The 1857 rebellion has taken place. And perhaps that's why he's aware that there's also a need to develop Hinduism not just as a modern religion, but also as a muscular, somewhat nationalistic or proto-nationalistic identity. And for this, he has various schemes. For example, when Queen Victoria is declared Empress of India in the 1870s, there's a big darbar that's held in North India, and all of the Hindu princes, etc., have landed up to pay homage to the viceroy who represents the queen. And Dayananda actually travels here hoping to lobby these Hindu princes because they have resources, they have territories, they have money, they have social capital. And he wants them to sort of help regenerate Hinduism on the ground. So it's not just an intellectual framing of Hinduism like Ram Mohan Roy. He wants Hinduism redefined ground up. At a later time, he establishes an organization called the Arya Samaj. And the Arya Samaj really tries to mobilize Hindus, including after Dayananda's death, by using shared motifs. So Hindus are divided into different castes. You can have different traditions. Somebody may worship a deity with using milk and honey. Somebody else may have blood sacrifices. They may not approve of each other. Yet there are certain shared feelings. For example, venerating the cow. A lot of the Hindu castes do venerate the cow. And so cow protection is popularized by Dayananda and the Arya Samaj in order to unite these disparate castes and groups of Hindus under a single political umbrella. They start, in fact, even mimicking missionary techniques. So at one point, you have missionaries like Francis Xavier converting whole villages of people and hundreds of people in one go. The Arya Samaj borrows that same technique and now reconverts lapsed Hindus or people who've gone into Islam or Christianity to Hinduism using similar strategies and similar techniques. Just as the missionaries set up schools in India and hope that these will also function in the long term as evangelistic agencies, the Arya Samaj also sets up schools. It also trains teachers. It also sends out men to actually proselytize and revive a certain and bring back people into the Hindu fold. So you find the initial germination of a kind of muscular, on-the-ground, mass-mobilized kind of Hinduism under this gentleman called Dayananda. But there's also contradictions. As I mentioned, there is caste. Caste is the elephant in the room. And in the Deccan or in Maharashtra, again towards Western India, you have a figure like Jyotiba Phule. He, in fact, appropriates the missionary critique. So just as missionaries lampoon Hindu gods, point out all the inconsistencies in Hindu mythology, etc., Jyotirao Phule takes those critiques and he uses that to excoriate Hinduism from within, to push back against power structures within, the dominance of the Brahmin caste, the suppression of what are called the Dalits, or the lowest of the caste categories, who are essentially treated very, very badly. They considered ritually defiled and impure, etc. So he uses the missionary critique, but not to promote Christianity, but to call for a to call for a sort of dismantling of caste and injustice within the Hindu order, and to call for modernity within the Hindu order. So you find figures like Ram Mohan Roy or Dayananda are externally oriented. They want to look at Hinduism and save Hinduism and redefine Hinduism face to face with a white man or with other faiths, etc. Phule is more interested in using this movement and this juncture to modernize Hinduism from within and wipe out caste injustices, etc. To the extent that he's even welcoming of missionaries, because he thinks in many ways the British and the presence of the missionary allows lower caste marginalized Hindus to stand up to upper caste dominant Hindus and reset the political sort of power structure between them. So you actually find critics of Phule calling him a missionary in Hindu clothing. People call him anti-national because he doesn't feel that the coming of the British was the worst thing that happened to India. He, in fact, thinks of the British as a liberating force. And this contradiction continues to this day in modern Hinduism, including in political Hinduism or Hindutva, which is caste and injustice within. That is, as much as these Hindu nationalist groups want one homogenized political Hindu identity, they are less willing to be radical when it comes to internal inequalities and internal dynamics of caste, etc. And that contradiction remains, and that was the contradiction Phule highlighted. So with just these three characters and their ways of looking at modern Hinduism and how they would define the modern identity itself of Hindus, you can see that it wasn't just one formula or one way. There were different kinds of responses to colonialism, to encountering the West, to modernity, to reshaping and reimagining religion that were emerging among Hindu thinkers and intellectuals, and these were not always consistent.
So I know at kind of the beginning of this interview, you talked about Hindu nationalism and how your book isn't quite an explanation of the modern day phenomenon of Hindu nationalism, but you kind of want to set the scene for it. So, two questions, maybe one more descriptive, the other calls for some speculation. But, as you're reading through these earlier works, I mean, do you start to see the debate over Hinduism get connected to the debate over Indian nationalism? There's a little bit of this coming through in, I'm going to get his name wrong, Savarkar, where he starts talking about, India's, like, was it Christians and Muslims can never be Indians because they owe allegiance to a foreign holy land. So there's a little bit of this coming through in some of the early works, but kind of how do you start to see these two ideas get connected? And then for the speculative question, obviously people talk about Hindu nationalism today. It's a big motivating force in India's politics today. How do these earlier debates about Hinduism connect to how you think people talk about Hindu identity today?
So there is an overlap between nationalism and this modern Hindu identity already taking place in the 19th century. In fact, one of the first critiques of colonialism in the country, at least in the English language, is in the 1840s by a young guy in his 20s called Bhaskar Pandurang. He's about 26 when he dies. He writes 6 letters to a newspaper called the Bombay Gazette. And in this, he critiques, of course, the economic policy of the British, the political policy of the British in India, but also religion. He essentially says something along the lines of how under the Mughals and Islamic rulers, while occasionally there was pressure to convert to Islam, at least if you converted, you would gain something. You would gain status, you would gain office. But with the British, while on the one hand, it seemed like they wanted Hindus to be, in quote, civilized and convert to Christianity, there was nothing to be gained because their racism prevented them from ever seeing the brown man as an equal. So even if you converted, you would always be treated as a second-class citizen. So you find that there's an early fusing here of that economic and nationalistic, economic and political criticism with a kind of religious fervor as well. And you find that later periods also, Indian nationalism has always got a bit of that Hindu flavor. Even under Gandhi, Gandhi also represents a Hindu mind. He was a committed Hindu. His politics was framed in Hindu terms. So when he said that the ideal Hindu society for him was Ramarajya, that term refers to the legendary Hindu king Rama and his ideal world. And and Gandhi was trying to resurrect or using that as the metaphor, as the ideal that Hindus should look forward to. So you find Gandhi also inflected his nationalism with a lot of Hindu terminology. And this is how, for example, somebody like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who's the founder of Pakistan, is alienated from the Congress party that was the vehicle for Indian nationalism in this time. But even before Gandhi, you find that there were political leaders. And one figure I do highlight in the book is someone called Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He was a nationalist. He was anti-British. He was somebody who played a very important role in moving nationalism out from what was called that debate society environment of English-speaking Indians debating things and writing in newspapers. But he moved it from there into the streets, into getting urban crowds interested in nationalism, interested in standing up to the British and asserting their identity. But he did this not by lecturing them on democracy or introducing Western concepts around freedom or liberalism, etc. He did this by using religion. He essentially converted religious festivals, which were Hindu festivals, into political platforms. So he, in fact, created new religious festivals. For example, he created a very popular festival, which still happens in Western India and is, in fact, spreading to most parts of the country now, called Ganpati Festival, where there's one deity called Ganpati is celebrated and worshipped for 10 days, and there's a big procession taking Ganpati to a water body or a river, and then the images are dropped in the river to melt. And what's interesting is that he was able to get this festival it was originally largely a private worship, but he made this a public spectacle, a public worship. So different caste groups, different communities living in a city could all have their Ganapatis. And on the 10th day, they would all converge into a grand procession, passing through the streets of Pune and Bombay and all these other Western Indian cities, and become a public demonstration of sorts. And speeches would be given here, telling people, using Hindu mythology, Hindu history, Hindu icons from the past, often, in fact, written about in English texts by white people who had studied them. How these historical figures were seized upon by these Hindu politicians to actually inspire people to stand up to the British, to gain some national self-respect and confidence, etc. So you do find a fusing of their religious and cultural identity with this feeling of nationalism. And of course, there are politicians who are very uncomfortable with it. There's a group called the moderates who do not want religion to come into this because they think that it'll drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims. But yes, the Congress party and the Congress national movement against the British always had a strong Hindu constituency within it. And it did play a very important role. So one cannot say that Indian nationalism was divorced entirely from religion. There was always an undercurrent where Indian nationalism also sort of overlapped with cultural Hindu nationalism. What's interesting, though, is that this, for a lot of Hindu thinkers, what exactly it meant to be Hindu. So the very word Hindutva, which is representative of Hindu nationalism today, translates as Hindu-ness. What is it that makes you a Hindu? Now, somebody like Tilak would try to define it in religious terms. He'd say that you have to believe in the Vedas, you must worship the cow, you must believe in multiple paths to God, as opposed to the missionaries' insistence that there is only one path to God, etc., etc. But this formula was always limited because, as I said, India has so many diverse traditions within that common Hindu framework that you always find contradictions. So if it's about venerating the Vedas, there are actually Hindu schools that do not venerate the Vedas, that do not think the Vedas are the supreme scripture, and they push back against that idea. As much as most Hindu castes, especially of the upper caste grouping, venerate the cow and worship the cow, there were also Hindus who did not do that, who had no hesitation eating beef lower down the caste spectrum. So there were lots of contradictions in attempting to shape or define Hindu-ness on religious terms because it wasn't always adding up, and not everybody could be included into that category if it was a religious definition. Then there's a man who's essentially Tilak's protege and disciple called B.D. Savarkar, who in the 1920s gives Hindutva or Hindu nationalism a new definition. And this is the enduring definition with which we live today, and by the definition by which Hindu nationalism operates in India today, where the religious is really not emphasized that much. Yes, religion matters, but it's not the definition of what makes a political Hindu. What Savarkar essentially says is that to be recognized as a Hindu in India, it doesn't matter what your religion is. All you need to know, you need to have is that your fatherland and your holy land must both be in the Indian subcontinent. So you must be descended from people from the Indian subcontinent, but your religious traditions must also have originated in the Indian subcontinent. What this does is that all the Hindu sects, such as Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shaktism that I mentioned earlier, but also non-Hindu groups like the Buddhists and Jains, they can all be considered Hindus in the political sense because their fatherland as well as their holy land exist in India. Jainism and Buddhism also existed and they were born in India, therefore they belong and they are part of the Hindu tradition. Sikhism similarly, it originated in India, therefore it is fundamentally Hindu in the political sense. But it leaves out those whose holy land is elsewhere. For instance, the Muslim with his holy land in Mecca, and the Catholic or the Christian whose holy lands are again in Rome or wherever else. So what this does is it doesn't emphasize religion as such, but emphasizes cultural identity and the subcontinent as a territorial unit, and says you have to be born, your ancestors should have been born here, and your religion should have been born here. And this is how we frame Hindu nationalism. And that definition is what we are living with today. And that definition is what energized Hindutva and gave it its lasting, enduring form that continues even into the 21st century. Of course, it has its contradictions. Savarkar defined it this way, but of course, on the ground, Hindus weren't willing to give up their caste identities and their regional identities, etc. And during his lifetime, Savarkar didn't have much success. In fact, he died in the 1960s, a fairly bitter man. He flirted a little bit with the ideas popularized by the Nazis, etc. And that didn't go down well after the Second World War. He cooperated with the British at a time when Gandhi and the nationalists were fighting the British in the 1940s during the Second World War. So even in that sense, people often joke about how he made no contribution to the historical freedom struggle, etc. So his story is a bit uneven that way. But you see, the power of an idea is that even if it's latent at a certain point, it can be revived and given new life many years down the line. So Savarkar dies bitterly in the 1960s. But as I said, by the time I was growing up in the early 2000s, it was Hindu nationalism that was in power in the center in Delhi, in India. And in 2003, I think Savarkar's portrait was installed in Parliament. And since 2014, for the last 11 years now, we've had a Hindu nationalist government ruling this country. So the idea continued to simmer. It continued to be there under the radar, as it were. And from the 80s onwards, through the 90s, and now, of course, into the present, it slowly started strengthening itself and is today, in many ways, resetting political equations and the fundamental ground rules of politics and identity in contemporary India.
So with that, I think that's a great place to end our conversation with Manu Pillai, author of Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, The Making of the Modern Hindu Identity. Manu, I actually have two final questions for you, which are, where can people find your work? Not just this book, but all of your work, including your previous book, one of which was done on the show. So where can people find all your work? And number two, what do you think your next project might be?
Well, the next project, to be honest, this book has squeezed the life out of me, so I do not want a next project for some time now. I'm quite determined that I'm going to take a break from research and writing for at least the rest of this year before I step into anything else. In terms of where it can be found, if you're in India, you can find it in India. It's been published by Penguin, Alan Lane. It's available on Amazon, etc. There's also a website called Padhega India, which delivers it abroad. If you're in the UK, Penguin's published that end of January in the UK as well. So there's a UK edition and there's an Indian edition, and you can order it from your bookstores, you can order it from Amazon, etc.
So you can follow me, Nicholas Gordon, on Twitter at NickRiGordon. That's NickRiGordon. You can go to AsiaReviewBooks.com to find other reviews, essays, interviews, and excerpts. Follow them on Twitter at Book Reviews Asia. That's reviews plural. And you can find many more author interviews at the New Books Network at newbooksnetwork.com. We're on all of your podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Rate us, recommend us, share us with your friends to support us interviewing those writing in, around, and about Asia. Stay tuned for more news coming up on the show. But before then, Manu, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.